So maybe we had a wrong impression, so you can ask, like in Christian's talk, as many questions as you want while the presentation is there. So it's a small disclaimer just saying these slides are part of a much larger slide deck, which is open source, and you find notes, and I think we share slides in the Google Docs anyway. So yeah, so the outline of the talk is I'm going to talk about the construction of payment channels in Bitcoin. I start with a small motivation from HTTP, then I do the real channel construction. Then I talk a little bit about the peer protocol for channel management without the HTLCs, because HTLCs and multi-hub is something that is supposed to be in a later talk, just from the structure how we're doing this. So we're talking about the peer messages for opening a channel. I have a small word about SegWit and transaction mailability. And then I talk about 3 ways how to close a channel. So yeah, let's start with the construction of payment channels. So first of all, why do we do this? What is the purpose of a trustless bidirectional payment channel in the Lightning Network? So first of all, we want to be able to send payments between 2 partners. And this should be done instantly. It's basically instantly means it's like updating a balance sheet, right? You heard the term of channel capacity and channel balance often when you talk about the Lightning Network. It should only be bound by network traffic over the internet and not depend on other stuff, right? It should be as fast as possible. We don't want to have a direct involvement of the blockchain in our payment channel, right? So as long as everybody plays by the rules, we don't involve the blockchain. And then we want to do it in a way that there's no need for any partner to trust the other side, right? This morning we talked a little bit about trust. And what I always like to say is, in Lightning, we still trust somebody. Who do we trust in Lightning? Well, to some degree, yes, obviously. The blockchain, yes. I mean, this is really where all the trust is being pushed to and mitigated to, right? So the Bitcoin blockchain and the Bitcoin network and the blockchain needs to be trusted. But the Bitcoin network will only need to be trusted in order to settle conflicts if they arise. Then we don't want to have high fees or overhead when sending payments within the channel. And the crucial part about these channels is that payments can go back and forth, right? As Christian mentioned, historically we already had single channels where we could send in one direction, and then we had to close the channel and open a new one. And with these channels, we can send money back and forth, and this is really cool construction. Of course, we want to scale the usage of Bitcoin. I mean, that's the higher goal or motivation why we're building this entire Lightning Network anyway. So yeah, the question is that we're trying mainly to resolve here is, how can this technically be possible? And I should already mention there are other constructions. Christian, what is the other construction? I think L2.
Simple micro-pair.
Yeah, and L2, right? So yeah, as I promised, let's start with a small comparison with HTTP. As you all probably know, HTTP is the request and response protocol, right? Which means you, the client or the browser, can make a request to some server, and then the server gives you a response in return. And according to the protocol, a server cannot initiate a communication with the client in HTTP, right? If you open your browser, it will hardly happen that Facebook decides, oh, I want to talk to you, and they just load the Facebook page in your browser, right? You have to type in facebook.com, and then you hit enter, and then you start the conversation with them. So my question is, how can a website, for example, Twitter, give us a notification that some new data is there on their website, right? If you are on this website and new tweets appear, you see a message, there's new tweets, you can load them, and you didn't ask for it directly, at least from your user experience, that did not happen, right? And this is all happening over HTTP. So my response to this is, they do this by abusing the protocol. And it's known as a server push or long polling or these kinds of things, right? And if we look a little bit back in history, it took us about 10 years to figure out how to do this stuff. Right? HTTP was invented in 1989, 1990, around this time. And it was just in the early 2000s when people really started doing all this AJAX magic and these kinds of things, right? So maybe people already knew before that it could be done, but it was not really implemented. And I just want to review a little bit how does the HTTP server push work. So you load a web page, and then JavaScript secretly initiates another HTTP request with the web server. And the server looks if it has some information for the client. So for example, are there new tweets? And if there is information, yes, you get a response. Here's the information you requested. Interesting case is if there's no data, then usually what you would expect is the HTTP request would finish and say, no, there is no data for me. But in our case, with the server push, it defers answering that request to some time in the future, right? It just keeps your TCP socket open over which HTTP is running, and it waits to the future. And how long does it wait? Well, if new information for the client is available, or if the client opens a new page and can't receive the response anymore, right? And in these cases, something happens. Or there's a heartbeat mechanism, right, to reestablish the connection all the time. And then the answer comes. But from an end user perspective, it really looks like the server has initiated a conversation. Because on your web page, magically something appears. And because the end user usually doesn't know the AJAX request is outstanding. You can read more about this on Wikipedia, obviously. The argument that I'm trying to make is that Lightning uses the same idea of deferring something to the future, or of not playing properly by the Bitcoin protocol. So payment channels are constructed by deferring the publication or broadcast of some transaction to the future. So Bitcoin obviously is not a request-response protocol. It's rather a broadcast gossip protocol, right? You have a Bitcoin transaction, and once it's done, you broadcast it to everybody, and everybody can say, yeah, we reply it, and then we mine it and do all that kind of stuff. So the question here is, in Lightning, what exactly is being deferred to the future? And I'm pretty sure you all know this, right? What are we deferring to the future in Lightning? The publication of transaction, yes. So transaction spending outputs, they are held back from being broadcasted, right? So we look into the details in the remainder of the talk. So later transactions are purposely tried to be double spent, right? In Lightning, we're double spending transactions all the time. This is really what's happening, right? The bad word, right? We're trying to make Bitcoin in order to solve the double spending problem. And now we're trying not to use the blockchain, or at least use it as little as possible, and we're double spending all the time. It's a little bit hilarious, but this is apparently how it works. And I mean, obviously, a transaction can only be spent once by the end of the day. This is how the Bitcoin network helps us with consensus and making sure that the protocol works. And Lightning, or the Lightning Network protocol, or the construction of payment channels, how I see it is to make sure that the correct double spend is by the end of the day being broadcasted, right? So we have a transaction, we have hundreds or thousands of double spends, and the Lightning Network protocol is trying to make sure that the correct double spend is the one that is actually being mined. So yeah. So what I wanted to say with this, the payment channels to Bitcoin are what the HTTP server push is to HTTP. So it's a non-obvious use of the Bitcoin protocol. And it took us, like in HTTP, a little while to figure out how to do this properly. I think we're still, to some degree, trying to figure out and making it better. So yeah, let's dig into this. So from a technical perspective, a payment channel is a 2 of 2 multisig address together with some smart contract. And I put smart in parentheses with a question mark because I'm not too fond of this term, but I think by the end of the day, it is a smart contract. So yeah. So 2 out of 2 multisig address means that the output script of a transaction requires, that spends this transaction requires 2 keys in order, or 2 signatures better, in order to be able to spend this transaction. And it's a form of a pay-to-script hash in our case, and this usually always looks something like this. So you have like the serialized script and the hash of it, and you have the opcode, and you check if it's equal or not. And then the input script is, you have all the signatures, depending on what the script is like, and then you have the serialized script. And in case of n of m multisig, you can basically sorry, I'm always hitting the wrong key here. You have the output script is the same, but the input script really has the signatures in this way. So you have the check multisig opcode. Okay, so in Lightning, the smart contract is called the revocable sequence maturity contract. So we start with a 2 out of 2 multisig wallet that has some funds. And this is something that we definitely see on chain, right? We discussed privacy before, where we talked about what do we see on chain and what do we not see on chain. This is something we see on chain. We don't necessarily know that this is a Lightning funding transaction or Lightning wallet or wallet that is like backing this channel, but we see it on chain. The question to us is who owns these funds? So the channel partners do not share these two private keys with each other, right? Everybody just has one private key, right? So not a single person can access these funds right away, right? I always need to like communicate with the other person in order to access these funds. And I would argue, depending on how we are spending these funds, this is how the funds are being owned. Right? So I have this multi-signature wallet, there's some funds on them, and I make a transaction, and in this transaction I'm saying, well, 60% of the Bitcoin go to me and 40% of the Bitcoin go to you. And this is how we define ownership of the funds that are in this wallet. Right? The transaction is defining the ownership. So this particular transaction that defines ownership, we keep this secret if possible, as long as possible. Basically, we never want this to be public. And this will encode the balance, as I just explained, right? 60-40 or 50-50 or whatever. And this transaction is called a commitment transaction. I think you all heard the term before. And it has to be signed before publishing the funding transaction. The funding transaction is the one that sends Bitcoin to this 2 of 2 multisig wallet. So some technical details. As I mentioned before, this funding transaction is heavily being double spent, which by Bitcoin is impossible. We secure the funds with time locks. This is what's being used to make the smart contract really work in the way how we want it to work. And it allows for conditional hash time locked outputs that we use in routing. So this is a later talk today when we talk about those. And yeah, RSMC is the revocable sequence maturity contract. So I draw some pictures, and I wanted to actually steal your lock, but I haven't managed to actually find one and do it. So let's just assume we have some output over here of 100 millibitcoin, and it's controlled by Alice Key. And Alice is in her funding transaction with the input script referring to this output and is creating a new output that says everything goes back maybe to Alice and Bob's key, right? Which means it's a 2 out of 2 multisig wallet. And I make heavy use of colors in the following slides, so I want to talk about the legend for these colors. So if something is white, it means it is broadcasted and mined, right? This transaction technically could also be created if this was not broadcasted and mined, but let's assume this one has enough confirmations, it's mined and broadcasted, then it's fairly safe to make this transaction and refer to this output. If the background of a transaction is gray, it means that it's not broadcasted yet. And if it's green later on, it means we should broadcast this right now, and we should really want to broadcast this one. And red has two meanings. Either it means it should not be broadcasted, or it means it cannot be mined, meaning the outputs are already consumed. Like it would be a double spend if it would be mined, right? So these are the legends. So what we do then when we have this funding transaction, we create a so-called commitment transaction. And the commitment transaction also has an input, which is referring to the output of the funding transaction. And maybe Alice, when she was creating the channel, was already saying, well, Bob should already have some money. So she decides that the commitment transaction has two outputs. 70 millibitcoins go to Alice and 30 millibitcoin go back to Bob. Right? And here I wrote it last time, that these transactions are all unpublished at this point. Once we have signatures for the commitment transaction, this transaction can be published. Right? Because now it's safe for Alice to publish this one. She knows she can always get her amount of Bitcoin back because she already has a signed commitment transaction and she doesn't need Bob at this point in order to do something. And for those who understand Lightning a little bit better, I should say this as a disclaimer. This currently is just leading up to the final construction. There's some like slight or minor mistakes here. This would not completely work yet, but we are extending this example on the fly. Just for those who already know the entire construction, not to be confused. Are there questions so far? All right. So, as I mentioned before, the commitment transaction is really encoding the balance of the payment channel, right? So the capacity is 100 millibitcoin and the balance is, Alice has 70 millibitcoin and Bob has 30. And this transaction can be broadcast to the Bitcoin network at any point in time, which is really nice. So if Alice and Bob have a disagreement, if somebody of these two people disappears, the other person can take this commitment transaction, broadcast it to the blockchain and say, hey, this is how I want the world to look like. And the funding transaction must use SegWit outputs to prevent mailability. I will later, after the construction, talk a little bit more about mailability and why this is important. But I just want to mention it here already. So now we create a second commitment transaction. Bob updates the channel balance, right? So if you look at this, this is exactly the picture as we had it before. But now we have the commitment transaction 2 coming to this. This one is also referring to the output of the Multisig wallet. But now Alice gets 80 millibitcoin and Bob gets 20 millibitcoin. What this means is that effectively Bob has sent 10 millibitcoin to Alice. Right? Because before Alice had 70, now Alice has 80. What's the problem with this situation? Yeah, exactly. Right? After Bob does this, Bob gets a decent meal from Alice, right? They have a great time. And then Bob decides to broadcast this commitment transaction. Right? So if Bob does this, this one cannot be mined anymore because this one is already mined. Right? They're both public now. And effectively, Bob has stolen 10 millibitcoins from Alice. This is bad. This is something that should not happen, right? And as I mentioned before in Lightning, we're trying to make sure in the protocol, by modifying these outputs a little bit, that this situation cannot occur. Okay, so how do we do this? Just, again, this is our goal. Make sure that as soon as we have this one and it is still unpublished, this one should or cannot be broadcast for some reason. So we do this by modifying the output in the commitment transaction so that fraudulent publishing will punish the publisher. So we change this output a little bit. And so, for example, the punishment would be to give the silent party, the party that didn't publish this, all the outputs that would go to the other party, right? The penalty mechanism that we know in the Lightning paper. So we do this by changing the output of the commitment transaction. And now I already did a slight modification of the commitment transaction. First of all, it's not called commitment transaction 1 anymore, but it's called commitment transaction 1B because it's Bob's commitment transaction. Alice has her own version of a commitment transaction, right? So we have 2 first commitment transactions. But the version for Bob looks like this, that 70 millibitcoin still go to Alice, but these 30 millibitcoin are not sent directly to Bob anymore, but they are sent to this output script, which is called the revocable sequence maturity output. And here you can see the entire script. It's a little bit technical. Let's rather focus on this kind of like picture. basically, if you look here, it has an if and an else, right? So it says, well, either you are in the case where you have the revocable delivery, which means after a relative time lock, Bob can claim with his key the 30 Bitcoin, as he should be able to do, because this is his funds. But before this relative time lock has passed by, there is the breach remedy transaction, or the breach remedy condition, in which this output can be claimed if there is Bob's and Alice's revocation key, or the first revocation key. But every commitment transaction has their own revocation key later on, because you want to change them for every state. So these are the two possible ways of being able to spend this commitment transaction. Right? And if you looked before in, here I refer to this as a double spending. And here in this picture, this is not a double spending, just to make sure that we're talking about the same thing, because this is just a visual representation of this entire script, right? I mean, this is just helping out to better understand what's written here in script code of Bitcoin script. All right, so what does this help us to modify the output like this? Well, let's assume that the commitment transaction gets published on the blockchain. Within the first 144 blocks, what can happen is only Alice is able to spend this output, because Bob with his key can't do anything. There's this time lock, right, that prevents Bob from actually spending this output, right? I mean, the script is there, but Bob with a new transaction cannot use this output because the Bitcoin network will prohibit this. Alice, however, if she for some reason has Bob's key, she could do this. And Bob does not have Alice's key. Right? And in the other situation, let's assume Alice does not have Bob's key. After 144 blocks, Bob is able to spend this output. So yeah, that's the construction basically. Yeah?
The other one be white, right?
This one?
Until it's on chain, the other one can still be used.
So I have to, well, the thing is, when you think about it even more, actually both of them should be white, because this one is just a visualization of this script, and this script is already white, right? I mean, this entire script is on chain. But the reason why I think I made it gray was the transaction that's actually really spending this output does not have to be published at this point in time. So I should rather make it green in the sense of like he can do it. Yeah. But I mean, we're basically, yeah. Okay. So now what happens if the channel state or the channel balance is being updated, right? So remember, we had the first commitment transaction 1B, and we have our contract, our revocable sequence maturity contract with it. And then we have our second commitment transaction in which Bob has sent some money to Alice. So what I argue is that this transaction should not be published by Bob anymore. Why? Why should Bob not do this? Yeah. He loses his funds, right? So in order to lose his funds, Alice has to do something. She has to say, yeah, I'm only signing this commitment transaction if you share your revocation secret with me. Right? So only this commitment transaction is only publishable if it's signed by Alice and Bob. And this will only happen if Alice has Bob's revocation secret. And then in this situation, the entire setting is safe. Right? Because now Bob is incentivized, if he needs to broadcast something to the Bitcoin network, to use this commitment transaction. If he uses that one, he has the fear of losing his funds. So let's just make it explicit. Let's assume that this transaction is being published and mined. Obviously, this one cannot be mined anymore, because it would be double spend of the funding transaction. But since Alice has her revocation keys, she now should really go for the breach remedy condition, and she should try to collect the entire outputs. If she does not do this, by the way, Bob can, after the time lock, get his funds. Right? This is the reason why Lightning nodes need to be online. Right? If the Lightning node goes offline for a certain amount of time, and the time lock is gone, let's say Alice node is offline, then Bob could still get his funds and publish an old state. But that's a gamble, right? Yeah. So some remarks on the presented simplifications, because there were still some simplifications in this. In order to be able to ascribe blame, both sides get their own commitment transactions. So, as you saw, I called the commitment transactions 1B, 2B, 3B for Bob. And basically, in a symmetrical way, there's commitment transactions for Alice, only that the revocable sequence maturity contract now is for Alice output, right? So Alice output is time locked there. And then, of course, if one of these commitment transactions is being broadcast, the other person sees, oh yeah, it's theirs and not mine. Right? And also the revocation key is a different one then. So then there's transactions for every channel update. So, sorry, I have to go to the next one. I don't know why I put this statement here. For every update of commitment transactions, new revocation keys have to be created, right? They don't use the same revocation key over and over again, right? Because then after sharing the revocation key for the first time, obviously this would be a bad situation, right? Because then for the next transaction, I could already guess the revocation key and already claim it even though I should not have it. And as we discussed before, there is this smart way of generating the revocation keys as a shard chain, so you don't need to store all the old revocation keys. It's sufficient to only store a couple of revocation keys. Yeah, as I mentioned before, future breach remedy transactions, if the revocation keys were always the same, could be spent right away, right? So we need own revocation keys. Yeah. The commitment transactions will have even more outputs, right? So we only saw 2 outputs in the commitment transaction, which was the time-locked output that goes to myself, basically, which can be like taken away as a penalty, and the output of the channel partner. But there's also HTLCs that are additional outputs in the commitment transactions. And I, in this talk, will not talk too much about HTLCs because Fabrice is doing a talk about HTLCs afterwards, and then in the multi-op talk, I will use them again to also show you how actually funds are being exchanged in one channel. So yeah, there's a small reading suggestion for a payment channel construction with less overhead, and that's the L2 paper. So a simple layer 2 protocol for Bitcoin. I think one of the authors is sitting here. He's trying to shill it all the time. And there's also Lalu from Lightning Labs who helped with it. And on my blog, I wrote a summary on this. There's actually another very good summary by Lisa Nygut. She also wrote a summary on her blog, yeah. But even the paper is pretty, I would say, easy to read. So, yeah, I don't talk more about L2 today. Some remarks on dust outputs, because they are an issue. As you know, in Bitcoin, outputs must have a certain amount, otherwise the fees will be higher to spend the output than the amount that is attached to the output, right? And then the blockchain could be spammed. And dust limits depend on the script and is usually a few hundred Satoshis, right? So the question is, what's happening if I make a Lightning payment that is less than a few hundred Satoshis? So let's say I want to transfer 1 Satoshi on the Lightning network. How does that work? So what we're doing in Lightning is if the outputs in the commitment transactions are below the dust limit, they will just be omitted. Right? So then they don't really exist. So the situation is, let's assume we have this channel where we have 100 millibitcoin as a capacity, and there's 50 millibitcoin for you and 50 millibitcoin for me. Now I can easily transfer 1 Satoshi because I can reduce your output, or I can reduce my output by 1 Satoshi and increase your output by 1 Satoshi. But if I initially fund the channel and I have all the funds on my side, I cannot really send 1 Satoshi to you, because then you would have an output that has 1 Satoshi, and this would be below dust limit. So your output would be omitted right away. And when the output is omitted, it's not getting back to me, but it's added to the fees that are being paid for the commitment transaction in case the transaction is going to be mined. So while Lightning implementations support these tiniest payments, those amounts cannot always be enforced on chain. And this makes these tiny payments, or routing tiny payments, might make you lose some funds, right? So it's also, some people call it custodial to some degree, right? Because you kind of trust the other node that at some point in time when you make more updates, you eventually get an output that has maybe 100 Satoshi or something like that. I think all implementations currently can be configured to not accept payments under a certain amount if you want to avoid this kind of behavior. So yeah, this is the standard local witness script for commitment transactions. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the peer protocol. Because as Christian already mentioned in the first talk today, is that the update layer is really happening in Bolt 2, and this is called the peer protocol. So the purpose of the peer protocol is to establish a communication between two peers that are connected. And for the remainder of this talk, I assume there is a working, authenticated, and encrypted transport layer, which is Bolt 8 with a noise XK framework that we discussed before. So this is on top of a single TCP socket. So how will two nodes be actually able to maintain the revocable sequence maturity contract and the HTLCs, right? I mean, that goes a little bit in your direction, and part of this I will already answer. Also, how will onion packages being sent between peers, right? I think this morning somebody was a little bit surprised that the onion was part of a Lightning message and that there was like double encryption basically, because the onion is encrypted and then the Lightning message is encrypted again. And then we have the channel management and the operation of the channel, right? Which is basically is like how do these two interact with each other? So this means we have channel establishment, right? How do I actually open a channel, right? Because I only showed the cryptography so far, but not how on a communication level all of this is happening. And how do we close a channel? How is that actually working? And then the normal operation, that's really how we route payments or how we update an amount, and that's being in the next talk. So, yeah. So first of all, we have the format of Lightning messages. So we have a 2-byte field for the type, and then we have a variable length payload, which is at most 2 to the 16th minus 1 byte. And the format of the payload confirms to the type, right? So this is all specified in the bolts when you read about them. And even typed messages must be specified and must not be sent otherwise. This is actually the second time where the it's okay to be odd rule applies, right? It's not only for the features, but also for the messages. Okay. So I was a little bit confused before when you mentioned it for the feature flags. So there's also some logical groups of types if you look at the bold specification. So the first 32 types are for setup and control of how peers are interacting with each other. I think if you paid close attention to Christian's talk, there was type 16 that was init and type 17 that was the error message, right, which was the space and control. And then there is the types up to 127, which is channel establishment and closure of channels, which I will talk a little bit about it right now. And then there is channel operation, including setup and settlement of HTLCs, which is in the second talk I give today. And then the even higher types are for the gossip protocol. I think we talk about the gossip protocol tomorrow. So yeah, let's talk about establishing a channel. How does this really work? So this is the typical graphic that you often see, and These are names of Lightning messages, right? So there's two peers, A and B, and they already have a connection, so they peered, right? The key exchange with the noise XK protocol, this all worked. As I said, it's assumed that the transport is there. And then you have these messages, the open channel message, the accept channel message, the funding created, funding signed, and funding locked messages. And this is basically the workflow of how these messages are being sent to each other. And obviously there's some information attached to these messages, and we're going to look at these a little bit closer now. So yeah, these are the 5 messages. I think I mentioned this already. So let's start with the open channel message. And the arrow here means that it goes from Alice to Bob, right? We saw this on this big picture that Alice was on the left side and Bob on the right. So it's type 32. It's the first message in this block of messages. And it starts with a 32-byte chain hash. And the chain hash is the hash of the genesis block of this chain. It's a very interesting property, I would say, that when you open a channel, you specify on which blockchain you actually want to specify this channel. Right? We're always talking about the Lightning Network as a solution to scale Bitcoin. But technically, I could already include a chain hash of the Litecoin network or the genesis hash of the Litecoin network blockchain. And then this channel message and everything else would more or less go through. Right? So I can have channels on different chains. Then I have a temporary channel ID because the final channel ID is not determined yet. So this is just some random data for the nodes to refer to this. I have the amount of Satoshis that I want to bring to this channel. So this is the funding Satoshis. Push MSAT. So MSAT is always a millisatoshi. As you know, in Lightning, we calculate even a fraction of up to 1,000th of a Satoshi. And this is how much I might already push to the other side of the channel, right? When I open a channel, I could already say, hey, the other party already gets some money with it. Then I can put in the dust limit Satoshis. Okay, then the next field is the max HTLC value in flight. So this means what is the maximum amount of payment that is being supposed to be routed on this channel. You know, currently it's like hard fixed in Lightning that it can't be more than 4 million, I think. But 4 millibitcoin, 40, I don't know. But it's yeah, I think 40 millibitcoin, 4 million, right? So, but you could technically set here a different value, and then if both nodes agree to pursue on establishing the channel, you could already forward higher value. Yeah. And then the HTLC minimum MSAT value, as I said before, like too small HTLCs might not make sense for you because when the channel breaks, you might lose these outputs because they are below the dust limit, so you can also set this here. Then there's the true self-delay, which is basically the amount of blocks you would wait in your revocable sequence maturity contract. Then the maximum amount of accepted HTLCs, right? So maybe you don't want to have like too large transactions being on chain. So you say, I only want to allow 100 HTLCs on my channel concurrently at one moment. And other than that, I don't accept anymore. Your channel partner needs to know this. Then you have the funding pub key, which is the address of the 2 out of 2 multisig wallet that you are providing here. And then you have some base points for all the keys that are being used in Lightning. So there's the revocation base point, the payment base point, the delayed payment base point, and the HTLC base points, because all of these addresses are derived from their own base points and the first per commit base point. So if you think about these, I mean, it's a very technical list of data, but if you think about all these values that we have there, it's pretty much what you would assume when you see how Lightning works, right? I mean, the funding Satoshis make sense, the hash chain, and the rest is just like some configuration of the Lightning channel as it is. So this is what Alice suggests to Bob and says, hey, I want to open a channel, and this is my offer. So now, now Bob will answer with the channel accept message. And what you can see is that most of the data values are the same. And I think the only difference that is here is the minimum depth. which means this is for how long the funding transaction should be confirmed before I make the channel operational with you. Right, and all the other values are, I mean, it's not the same data, right? The revocation base point and stuff, I mean, it's obviously different, but it's the same type of data that is being sent back, right? So basically these messages are very similar. So then you have the funding created message, right? And I just put this here again as a reminder of our graphical view, how this looked like, right? We have the funding transaction, it's not published yet, right? It's still gray, it's unpublished. But once Alice decides she wants to open a channel, she sends this message over to Bob. Bob replies with the accept channel message. Alice, it's her turn again to create the funding created message. So it still has a temporary channel ID, which must be the same as in the open channel message, right? She cannot just exchange this ID now. Then Bob would say, I don't know what to do with this ID. I did not agree to channel with this temporary ID. Then there should be a funding transaction ID, right? Even though the funding transaction is at this stage not supposed to be sent to the Bitcoin network. And Alice is also not sending over the funding transaction. She is sending the funding transaction ID to Bob. Why does Bob need the funding transaction ID? Yeah. So the commitment transaction is referring to the funding transaction, right? So he needs the transaction ID to point to it. And again, the transaction has to be non-malleable and must not be broadcasted at this time. Then we have a funding transaction output index, right? So technically, I mean, when you looked at this diagram, there was only one output in the funding transaction. But technically, you could have several outputs, and these several outputs could actually be outputs for different channels. So it's safer to say, hey, by the way, it's really the first output that you're trying to spend when you're trying to spend it in your commitment transaction. So the funding transaction output index is also sent over. And then, of course, you need a signature. And this is a valid signature using the funding pub key for the initial commitment transaction. And if this one is not correct, the other party must fail the channel and say, yeah, you know what, you're sending me some data, but I cannot do something with this. So then the funding signed message is being sent back, right? So this means we now have a commitment transaction over here, which has the channel ID, which is the funding transaction XOR the funding output index. So then there's a signature sent back for the first commitment transaction. So when I mean second signature, this means this is the signature that Bob will use to sign Alice's commitment transaction. Because, I mean, by the end of the day, when Alice opens the channel, she needs to have a commitment transaction that is safe to be broadcasted, right? So Bob already knows how the commitment transaction for Alice should look like, because he knows the base points and everything where the commitment transaction is being generated. So Bob can basically create this commitment transaction, and it needs two signatures, and the signature from Bob is being sent over to Alice. And if invalid, again, Alice will abort this operation and fail the channel. And of course, you must not broadcast the funding transaction, because that would be a bad idea, because now channel is funded, there is money at a multi-signature wallet, and Bob could blackmail her and say, hey, only if you give me that amount of Bitcoin to me, I will give you a signature. And if valid, of course, you should broadcast the funding transaction. Okay, so on transaction mailability and the need for SegWit, I promised in the beginning I would talk about this a little bit. So after signatures for commitment transactions are exchanged via the funding signed message, so we are here, the funding transaction is published by A, right? Because Alice now has the second signature, her own signature she can produce by herself, right? She doesn't need any communication for this. So let's assume she publishes the funding transaction. So what B can do is B can catch this funding transaction. And if B malleates the transaction, it gets a new transaction ID, and that is a bad thing. Right? Because when the transaction ID changes, then of course the commitment transaction that Alice has generated is pointing to nothing, right? And then of course your commitment transaction is not worth anything, right? So we really need this fact that the funding transaction cannot be altered anymore. So what are the ways to malleate a transaction? So this could happen by swapping the R and the S value of the signature or using a different encoding, I think. I have to admit, as I said before, I'm just 1 year in Bitcoin, so with some of the Bitcoin low-level stuff, I'm not too strong. Or the SIG script could be also changed in order a little bit, still executing the same, but changing the transaction hash. So you can read about it, obviously, in the Bitcoin wiki. And then B can, as I mentioned before, try to publish the malleated version. And the commitment transaction refers to the old transaction IDs. So if the transaction ID of the funding transaction is malleated, the commitment transaction becomes worthless, and B can blackmail A, and stuff can be very ugly. And this blackmail comes at no cost, right? Because I am B, I'm accepting a channel open message. And then at some point in time, I look at the blockchain, I'm faster in publishing or maybe I'm a miner, I can like stuck this transaction in, and now I can do crazy stuff with it. So SegWit mitigates the possibility to malleate these transactions. That's why we needed SegWait so badly. I think the script SIG could not be changed anymore. So then when we have this, we have the funding locked message. Right? So after the funding is published and broadcasted, we have the channel ID, we have the next per commitment point, right? So there's this bold 3 with the key derivation that explains how all these keys are being derived in a pretty smart, but I would say technical way. And the next commitment point is shared so that for the next commitment transaction, they can already like create signatures. And future base points cannot be derived from old ones. But I think old ones can be derived from future ones. And that's a pretty good thing. And the funding locked message, yeah?
What key is that you're derived again?
So when you looked at the, there are several base points, right? So you have, in the commitment transaction, you have the commitment base point. And the base points for these commitment transactions, they are all derived via an HD wallet, basically. But it's also basically used in the sense of like a shard chain. So you basically, you do reverse order, which means that you can, when you know a commitment point, you can from there derive all the old ones, but you cannot derive the future ones. Which is nice because then you don't have to store the old ones in case you need them anymore because you need to revoke a transaction or something. Yeah. So yeah, the funding locked message is necessary for the channel to become operational because you need the next commitment point. And the sender, it's specified in the protocol, must wait until the minimum depth that the receiver of the channel was requiring was achieved before sending this message. Not include any HTLCs or pending payments, right? Which means that you have to basically settle all HTLCs before you kind of like signal that you want to close a channel. You wait until all the HTLCs settle, you don't accept new HTLCs anymore, and then you make this final transaction. And it's also part of the old 2-peer protocol where it's written down how to do this specifically. Then there's the bad way of closing the channel, which is the unilateral close, which happens if the protocol, for example, was breached or if somebody is just not there anymore, because then you basically broadcast your commitment transaction. And if you want to find situations where this message happens, look in the bolts for the string must fail the channel. Whenever you find the string, it still could happen that you do a collaborative close, but it's not specified that if you must fail the channel that you do it in the unilateral way, but most of the time the unilateral way is actually happening then, because usually what led to the situation where you must fail the channel is already when somebody's not responding anymore if something bad is happening. So this is in the bolts where you find these cases where this actually happening. And it's, by the way, quite frustrating when it happens because your funds are time locked. Usually the fees are higher because, in the commitment transactions, you're just like guessing the fees that are in future when you publish this transaction, whereas when you mutually close this channel, you can look at what are the fees right now. So this is really bad. But it could also be accidental because there's hardware failure. Or the other side publishes the latest commitment transaction. It's part of Bolt 5 in the on-chain Bolt. And then there's the ugly way, which means that you use the revocation transaction close. Right? So somebody is maybe desperately, deliberately tries to cheat. Maybe not. Maybe there's just a software bug. I remember when I experienced such a software bug. I think you even have a better experience where you demonstrated Lightning. Right? So let's talk about the good way, the mutual close of closing a channel. And as I said before, that's always preferable to everybody. So we have a similar picture here. We have shutdown messages, we have closing signed messages. And the funny thing is the closing signed messages could occur quite frequently, right? It's not one exchange of these messages, but it could happen again and again and again until it might converge at some point in time. I think there's a mechanism for it that it will converge. So it excludes the time lock of the funds. Right? You make just a spend and you say this amount goes to you, this amount goes to me, and once we publish this transaction, we're happy, it just goes out. So partners can spend these funds directly. The fee can be negotiated while the closing takes place, right? And this potentially saves a lot of fees, right? Because you can basically look what the fee levels are. Only problem is if your fee estimation of both nodes is different, right? Because you might use different implementations and then you have different understanding of the world. And two messages are included, the shutdown message to signal the intent. Right? So basically what I do is I send a shutdown message saying, hey, I want to shut down this channel. And then Bob says, yep, I agree with you, right? Let's shut down the channel. If Bob doesn't send this, then I do force close. Bob has no interest in doing this because, I only sent this so I want to shut down the channel. So I'm daring of force closing. Yeah. I think I even have it on the slides, how, as I mentioned before, with the converging. That's why I just looked at the next one. So let's look at the shutdown messages, but these messages are very easy. So you have the channel ID, you have the lang, and the lang is that of the script pub key that is being used. So you can have different types of scripts for the closing transaction. You can either have a pay to public key hash or pay to public script hash or witness public key hash, and all these kinds of different script types are supported. And it must not, before the funding, created funding signed messages, right? So you cannot close the channel too early. And it may be done before the funding locked message, right? So if the funding transaction is already published and maybe has one or two confirmations, but the other person wants the channel not to be operational until there are 6 confirmations, you can already say, hey, I want to have a mutual close. You may do that. And the important thing is once you send this shutdown message, you will not accept incoming HTLCs anymore. And that's why you need also reply with the shutdown message so that both parties do not accept add update HTLC messages. And yeah, no future update messages will be accepted either. It's for the gossip protocol. Because it doesn't make sense to accept an update protocol with new fee rate if the channel is not operational anymore. So then comes the closing signed message, and if you look at it, it has the fee, satoshis, and the signature. Right? That's why you need to have it back and forth, because you need both signatures on both sides. And all HTLCs must be settled and cleared in the current commitment transaction. Right? So you have to wait maybe before you start sending these closed signed messages. So you send the shutdown messages, you settle all the HTLCs. That might take a while, but then you can do it. And if the fees of one round trip of closing messages are equal, then you should sign and broadcast the closing transactions because you have consents of the fees. And you can also close the connection, but you can still keep the peer connection alive. And otherwise, the fees should converge, right? So must be strictly between the two fee values that are suggested. So let's say you suggest 5 satoshis, I suggest 50. Now in the next step, we must get closer to each other, that at some point in time we find the same amount. Right, so the bad way is the unilateral close. I think I speed this up a little bit because I think it's, quite clear what's happening. So the most recent commitment transaction is pushed to the chain. The channel stops immediately to be operational, right? I mean, why sending any other channel operational messages back and forth? I mean, this thing is on chain now, or at least it's in the mempool. And almost the exact channel state is seen on chain, right? So you see the balance and you see basically all fully committed HTLCs where the output is higher than the dust limit. And then the HTLCs are spent with HTLC success transactions or HTLC timeout transactions, depending on whether the person who has this HTLC is able to provide a pre-image or not. You can see all of this. So yeah, obviously watching services could help to do so, and if no claiming within the time lock, the breaching party can spend their outputs, right? This is the 24 hours Christian was talking about. And this case should obviously never occur. So yeah, what can be seen by channel closes on chain? So that depends on the type of close. And the channel state in the case of forced close can be seen. In the mutual case close, only the final balance can be seen. And the pending HTLC outputs can be seen only if they are not below the dust limit. And there might be a fight about the HTLC sizes around. I don't know why this word is there, but there can be a fight, obviously, when you initiate the channel or when about the dust limit. Yeah. So nodes have an interest to be larger than the dust limit and the privacy where people might want to be below the dust limit, right? So if I'm a routing node, I will only route payments that are bigger than the dust limit, but if a person is very well for their privacy, they never want to see the payment hash or the pre-image later in the on-chain, right? So they only want to make payments smaller than the dust limit, and this might be also gamed by some people. There might be a rationale for retransmission of messages, so the communication transport is unreliable, right? So the noise FX program is on top of TCP, and I mean, I could disconnect or a node could shut down, right? So we don't know that all messages, once I send them, have really been arrived or are being replied. So at some point in time, I might have to retransmit communication messages. So I cannot assume, for example, that update HTLC messages were received unless a commitment signed message was received. And therefore, I might have to retransmit them again and again after a certain amount of time. Or I only store updates upon receiving the commitment signed transactions. And this ensures that the retransmission after channel reestablishment, right? So when you make the connection again, you have to retransmit some of your data in this like channel protocol. So there is this channel reestablish message that basically sends the current state of your channel to the other side, that basically says, hey, this is really where we are currently, and in this way you know where you are, that you can operate the channel from there on, because you don't know if the other messages have been arrived. Okay. And yes, these are some resources and helpful links, and